Shalom everyone, and thank you for joining me in the study of Parashat Achrei Mot-Kdoshim. You shall live by them. That's the title of the shiur. And it's obviously based on the following verse. ושמרתם את חוקותיי ואת משפטיי אשר יעשה אותם האדם. You shall keep, you shall observe my commandments, my laws, that a person should perform them. וחי בהם, אני השם. And you shall be alive with them, or within them, or by performing them. It's very ambiguous. It's very hard to understand. What does it mean, v'chai b'hem? And also, what will be the idea of performing mitzvot and, God forbid, to die with them or by performing them? So what we will try to do today is to try to explore few options among the commentators on this Parasha, and to try to understand what is the true meaning of v'chai b'hem, and you shall live by them. So, the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Yoma, says the following: v'chai b'hem, velo sheyamut b'hem. That when you perform the mitzvot, you should be alive, you shouldn't die by performing mitzvot. Now, we should pause here, and we should give a little bit of an introduction to one of the most famous subject matters in Judaism, which is what we call shalosh averot chamurot. There was a discussion among the rabbis, and the conclusion of that discussion was that there are only 3 commandments that you shall die for them and not violate them. But all the other commandments, if there is a situation, a condition, that you need to make a choice between performing the mitzvah or to die, you should not perform the mitzvah and keep your life. So what are those 3 very, very important mitzvot, commandments that you should give your life for them? So it's avodah zarah, idol worshipping, which means if someone tried to force you to worship idols, you shall give your life and not perform this act. Avodah zarah, gilui arayot, which means having some kind of obviously prohibited sexual relationship between the family, and shfichut damim. And if someone tells you that you must kill someone, unless, and if you don't do it, you will be killed, you can tell the person, I'm not going to kill anyone, you can kill me if you want, but I'm not going to kill anyone else. So those are the 3 averot chamurot, 3 very severe sins that you shall give your life and not violate them, but all the other commandments, you should basically violate them and continue to be alive. Why is that? So there are many, many reasons for that, many interesting explanations for that, but the idea is that all the other mitzvot, we would like you to continue to be alive, and you'll have the opportunity to maintain and to perform and to keep many other mitzvot for the rest of your life. But those 3 mitzvot that I mentioned before, idol worshipping, bloodshed, and prohibited sexual relationship in the family, those are probably 3 sins that the rabbis identified as something that will basically destroy who you are. And therefore, God demands that you will give your life for that. But all the other mitzvot, they are very important, very meaningful, but still do not require you to give your life for. Now, if we pause here for a second, there is something interesting. This idea is a very noble idea, because you would think that for every mitzvah that God commanded you, you must give your life for. If God commanded it, and someone else tells you to violate it, obviously you need to listen to whom? To God. And therefore, the first thought was that for every mitzvah, for every commandment, you should give your life. Therefore, the rabbi said, no, that's not what God wants you. God wants you to be alive so you will have the opportunity to do a lot of good in this world. There are 3 commandments that you must give your life for, because, as I said before, the rabbis identify them as something that if you will violate, it will basically destroy who you are. Now, one more detail that I think it's important, which is, there is what we call shat tzara or shat dchak, or a time which basically the enemies persecute us and chase us for who we are. And there, in that time, you need to give your life even for something very small. And why? Because everything we do as Jews, it represents God in a way. So let's sum it up. Basically, this Gemara in Yoma says to us, look, the Torah states, even though God commanded us all these mitzvot, all those commandments, and there is no really difference between the mitzvah of keeping Shabbat and the mitzvah to not to worship idols and the mitzvah to eat kosher, but God decided that there are only 3 mitzvot that you need to give your life for, and the rest of them you can violate in order to save your life. Unless, as I said before, it's a time where your enemies are basically chasing you and are after you for everything you do. Okay, so now we have the first understanding of the pasuk. A person might think that he needs to give his life or her life for every mitzvah, and the rabbis tells us, no, only for 3 mitzvot. Okay, so that's the first explanation. The Yalkut Shimoni, which is a midrash, and the rabbis looked at that pasuk and they said the following: V'chai bahem le'olam. So v'chai bahem means forever. But the rabbis ask, Im tomar ba'olam hazeh, Achrei ze sofo met. He says, but how can you understand it? What does it mean that he'll live forever? Not in this world. In this world, he's going to die. He or she are going to die. Someday, after 120 years, someone will die. Hamani mekayem v'chai bahem. So what does it mean v'chai bahem? La'olam haba. Wow. Total deviation from what we saw in Yoma. In Yoma, instructed Yoma, in the Babylonian Talmud, in Yoma, it talks more about the halachic aspect of this verse. Talking about the fact that these are the mitzvot that you need to give your life for, these are the mitzvot that you don't need to give your life for. The Yalkut Shimoni talks about a totally different aspect. V'chai bahem, which means the mitzvot will give you life. What kind of life? Not life only in this world, but mostly to the world to come. There is eternity. V'chai bahem le'olam, for eternity. Which means, whatever mitzvot you perform here, it's not only that you do it because God told you. It's not only because you do it because you are a committed Jew. It's not only because of the great benefit that you have as a person by performing mitzvot because it makes you a better person. But it also, in a way, creates an account for you in Olam Haba, in the world to come. So in a way, you work here and you get your reward in Olam Haba. So that's what the Yalkut Shimoni says. The Rashbam, that was Rashi's grandson, so we are talking about the 12th century in France, and he says the following: V'chai bahem, you shall live by them, aval im lo ya'aseh, but if you will not perform them, v'nichretu hanefashot ha'osot mikerev amam. Now the Rashbam reads the pasuk in a very interesting way. If I will go back to the pasuk, the verse says what? ושמרתם את חוקותיי ואת משפטיי אשר יעשה אותם האדם, וחי בהם, says Rashbam, if you want to be alive, if you want to maintain your life, you need to what? To observe the commandments and the laws that I commanded you. And you can hear from here that what? That if you are not going to perform them, says Rashbam, so then you're not going to be alive. Which means the Rashbam created some kind of a condition in the verse. If you will keep the mitzvot, you will be alive. If not, you understand what will be the outcome. Now this is a very interesting reading of the verse because there is not really a language of a condition, of a t'nai, of a condition. However, the Rashbam understands v'chai bahem not as a spiritual reward in the world to come, like Yalkut Shimoni, and not like the Babylonian Talmud that talked about these differences between mitzvot group A and mitzvot group B, but rather he looked at the pasuk and he says, you want to be alive, you want to have life, keep the mitzvot. You don't want to? Try your luck. So that's what the Rashbam says. Rabbi Yosef Parashot, 13th century now, in France as well, says also something along the lines of the Rashbam. And he says, v'chai bahem, and you shall live by them, שלא יהיו שניו מתקצרות, שאינו מת, אלא מיתת עצמו. It says, v'chai bahem, it's not a promise for any eternal life in the world to come. It's not anything halachic. It's just basically a matter of fact, which means if you want to die naturally, whatever it is, keep the mitzvot. If you interested in dying in a different way, don't keep the mitzvot and see what happens. This is a very harsh interpretation, basically saying that you have two options to keep your life. You are going to die. You are going to die by an unnatural way, or you are going to die by a natural way. And it's in your hands. If you will keep the mitzvot, you will die by a natural way. If not, not. Now, obviously, we understand that it's so loaded theologically, because basically he's telling us that every cause of death is obviously not keeping the mitzvot, and this is something that it's so hard for us to understand, to try to comprehend. So I will keep this interpretation for now, just in the theory, and not to try to put it into practice, because I think it's too overwhelming. אבל חוקות הגויים, says בחורשו, but the laws of the non-Jews, שגוזלים וחומסים וגונבים ורוצחים, ובאים אנשי חבריהם מקצרות ימיהם, שבאים בעלי הממון והורגים אותם. וכן בעל האישה לא יחמול ביום נקם, ואף הקרובים הורגים את הרוצח, וכתיב ושנות רשעים תקצורנה. Rabbi Yosef Bechor now is giving us a list to prove his point, which means, he says like that, the Jewish laws and commandments will basically create a society that will cause people to die naturally and not unnaturally. And what does it mean? So now he tried to clarify it. And I think he's trying to take it a step down from this theological issue, theological problem that I introduced you to just a few minutes ago. Which means, Rabbi Yosef Bechor says like that. He says, try to compare the Jewish laws versus the non-Jewish laws, at least in the 13th century in France. So I don't know exactly what's happened in the 13th century in France. Obviously for Jews it was not the golden era. But he says, look, the non-Jews who do not follow the Torah, basically there is thievery, there is murder, there is adultery. And then what will be the outcome of things like that? If a husband, for example, finds out that his wife had an affair with Francois, okay, he's going to murder Francois. So Francois, who was only 28 years old, this husband of this lady is going to kill him. Why? Because he had an affair with his wife, which means this Francois, instead of living until 120 years, he will die, he will be murdered at 28. Because what? Because they had this affair, or because of thievery. Okay, so the owner of the house, he will find out who was the thief, and he will chase him and he will kill him. Basically, obviously, Rabbi Yosef Bechor describes a society, a non-Jewish society, which has all the terrible things, corruption and thievery and murder and affairs and all of those terrible things. And he basically tried to prove what? Keep the Jewish laws. The Jewish laws that basically tells you shouldn't have an affair, you cannot murder, you cannot steal, basically keep society in a way that people will die, everyone will die, but they will die naturally. Naturally, sickness, death, whatever it is. But no one is going to kill someone else because he did something against him. And that's what it means, v'chai bahem. The mitzvot, God's commandments, are such that they create a healthy society. A society where people respect each other, they don't do things to each other that will cause murder or other things. And when you compare it to the non-Jewish laws, you will find there, because they don't keep what the Torah says, it's not for them, so they create a society that leads to murder and thievery, and people will die before, quote unquote, before their time. I purposely brought this explanation of the Bechor show because it creates more questions than answers. And this is something to think about. And I really would like everyone to think about this Bechor show. Because I think the way he portrays a non-Jewish society in the 13th century in France is not necessarily the reality that we know from history. Obviously, there was a lot of corruption and a lot of difficult things in other societies. But there was a king and there was a law and many other things. So we need to really take this Parashot and to try to see, by learning history, what exactly was happening in the 13th century. But in addition to it, we also know that even a non-Jewish law, it's not a divine law, but it also tried to build some kind of a moral or an ethical society. And Rabbi Yosef Parashot obviously does not see it like that. So it's something very interesting to think about. But if we deviate from the history and we just focus on the verse itself, Rabbi Yosef Parashot definitely has a very unique and original interpretation in the verse. V'chai bahem, meaning if we will go back to the verse says, Ushmartem et chukotai v'et mishpatai asher ya'aseh otam ha'adam, which means follow, observe, keep my commandments and my laws that you shall perform, and by performing them, it will give you life. Not eternal life, not a longer life, just your life. No one is going to murder you, no one is going to take your life, no one is going to make your life miserable. If you keep the mitzvot, not only you, the entire society, and then you will create a healthy society. But if not, your society will not be healthy, will not be moral, will not be ethical, and it will lead to murder, and your life will be cut short. Rabbeinu Bachya has somewhat of a totally different vantage point on this verse, and he says the following: Asher yaseh otam ha'adam v'chai b'hem, that a woman will perform them and they shall live by them. יחזור למשפטים שהם חיי האדם ביישובי הארצות, והם קיום העולם ועמידתו, הוא שכתוב, מלך במשפט יעמיד ארץ. Now this is a very interesting interpretation. Rabbeinu Bachya basically says, this Parsha talks about למשפטים שהם חיי האדם ביישובי הארצות, which means the laws of the state. Now, I am not sure that Rabbeinu Bachya talks only about Jewish laws. He might talk about any law, any state law that try to take care of some kind of a healthy and ethical society that gives life to people. And not only to the people, but also to the entire universe. And that's what it says. Melech b'mishpat ya'amid eretz. A king, if he wants to establish, to erect the land, meaning to maintain the land, he needs to have mishpat. So basically, and this is an interesting thing, let's go back to the verse. It says, Ushmartem et chukotai ve'et mishpatai asher ya'aseh otam ha'adam v'chai b'hem ani Hashem. There is something interesting here. Asher ya'aseh otam ha'adam. What does it mean, Adam? Human being. Now, this is a little strange. Why? Because we are talking to the Jewish people. It should have said, Ushmartem et chukotai ve'et mishpatai, asher ta'asu otam, that you shall perform them, v'chai b'hem. Rabbeinu Bachya, in a way, takes it more to the universal realm. And it says, Adam. Every time it says Adam, it means, most of the time, that it says Adam, it means the entire humanity. We spoke about it once in the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, where we talked about Adam ki akriv mikem. And we spoke about the idea that Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, even though it focused a lot about the Kohanim, it also did the introduction, the opening statement of Vayikra is about humanity. So the word Adam means humanity. So probably Rabbeinu Bachya looked at that verse and he says, wait, it doesn't talk only about the Jewish people, very much unlike the Bechor Shor, very much unlike the 13th century French commentator Rabbi Yosef Parashot. Rabbeinu Bachya Ibn Pakuda says, no, we are talking about laws in general. You need to keep my laws and my commandments. And by the way, as a side note, we know that a lot of the general laws, let's call it like that, accepted the 10 commandments. Not Shabbat, but in every society, they accepted the idea of you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, you shall not have take someone else's wife, You shall try to believe in God. Which means, in a way, the Ten Commandments and the Torah is in a way somewhat of a base for all the other judicial systems. And as such, Rabbeinu Bachye looks at the Mishpatim, at the laws, and says, wait, this verse basically talks about what? The importance, the significance of keeping the laws, keeping the Mishpat, the judicial system. And therefore, Asher Ya'aseh Otam Ha'adam, every person, every human being must follow the laws. And those laws will give you life. Because if not, there is going to be an anarchy. There is going to be a chaos. No one will follow anything. Everyone will do whatever they think, they feel it's fine or it's good. And no one will take into consideration anyone's needs, because everyone will be focused on his or her agenda. And that will lead to a terrible life in society. And therefore, Rabbeinu Bachye says, Adam, human beings, everyone should follow those laws and commandments, and then that will bring life to all. The Netziv has a little bit of a different aspect and perspective, and he says the following: וחי בהם, כבר נתבהר בספר בראשית, says I already explained in the book of Genesis, ובכל מקום, and every time, דחי פעם פירושו חי ולא מת, ופעם פירושו חי בשלמות ולא בשפלות הדעת. הוא מובן לפי העניין. Which means, the Netziv, Reb Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, says that the word וחי בהם, that you shall live, does not mean only, meaning it has two interpretations. The first interpretation is alive and not dead. That's the simple one. That's the basic one. The second interpretation is to live in wholesomeness, in maximizing your full potential, and with basically elevating yourself cognitively and spiritually. So there is one, when I will say about someone, oh, he is alive, it means he is alive, he's not dead. But that's the most basic physical level. And then I have, this guy is alive. He's full of life. Look at him. He reached this high level cognitively, spiritually, meaning he is alive. Says the Netziv, והכה לפי הפירוש השני, דקאי על מעשה המצוות הפשט ולא ימות שימות בהם. ולפירוש הראשון פירושו שיהיה נפשו מתענג בהרגש רוחני בהם. The Netziv says here, you can have that the two interpretations can apply on this verse. By performing and by fulfilling the mitzvot, you can have basically two benefits. One, that you are alive. You are alive, you are not dead. People who died cannot perform the mitzvot anymore. So by performing the mitzvot, you show that you are alive. But then there is another thing. The idea of keeping mitzvot that gives you life, that gives you the opportunity to raise yourself, to elevate yourself spiritually, cognitively, emotionally, religiously. The mitzvot, and this is the perspective that I would like us to discuss here. Sometimes we look at mitzvot as a burden. Oh, I need to do this, oh, I need to do that. There is another mitzvah that I need to do, and I'm afraid that if I will not do it, I will get punished. All of that, it's part of it, but there is another aspect that so many times we miss, which is when you perform a mitzvah, it gives you something. It gives you life. It gives you meaning. It gives you the tools to become a better person. It gives you the opportunity to go and to learn something in depth and to enrich yourself cognitively. It gives you the opportunity to attach yourself emotionally to God, spiritually, religiously. The word mitzvah comes from the word tzevet, togetherness. Basically, you join something, you join someone. The idea of mitzvot should not be looked at only as, oh, I need to do it. You know, there is a phrase, it's a shver to be a Yid, which means it's hard to be a Jew. Yes, definitely. There are many things that are hard. But you know what? There is a tremendous joy in performing mitzvot. There is a tremendous joy in basically fulfilling God's will, and also knowing that it's going to help me too, to become a better person. In a way, if you want to talk theology, do you think God really cares if you did this mitzvah or not? And the answer is, it's for you. It's mostly for you. Yes, God commanded you and you need to do it because God commanded you, but it's mostly for you. It's to create a healthy and an ethical and moral society. It's to create a better version of yourself. Therefore the Netziv says, V'chai bahem, you can inject life in who you are. Just to be alive and not to be dead, it's obviously something wonderful, but it's not enough. There are many people who are walking dead. There is no meaning in their lives. There are no aspirations. There is no system or some kind of a plan. How are they going to be better tomorrow? So you can be alive and you can almost still be dead. What the Netziv suggests to us, it's brilliant. He says, V'chai does not mean just physically that you are alive, but inject life into your life, which means meaning, accomplishment, aspirations, dream, inspiration. That's what the Netziv found in this verse. And now, let's see Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik talks about the idea of mitzvot very much along the lines of the Netziv, but he adds and he enriched this idea in a beautiful way. And he says the following. There were two mesorot, which means traditions, that Moses transferred to Joshua. One is the tradition of Torah learning, of lomdes, which means deep learning, like what we do when we study the Talmud, and halacha. The second mesorah, the second tradition, was experiential, which means an experience. One can know the entire Masechet Shabbat and yet still not know what Shabbat is. This is an interesting thing. Rav Soloveitchik tried to tell you that there is need to be a connection between your cognitive understanding and what we will call your emotional experience, but also I will call it emotional identification. Meaning, you can learn the entire tractate of Shabbat in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Jerusalem Talmud. Then you can learn all the laws of Shabbat, but you still might not know what Shabbat is. To truly know what Shabbat is, one has to spend time in a Yiddish home, in a Jewish home. Even in those neighborhoods made up predominantly of religious Jews, today one can no longer talk of the sanctity of Shabbat. True, there are Jews in America who observe Shabbat, but there are no Erev Shabbat Jews who go out to greet Shabbat with beating hearts and pulsating souls. There are many who observe the precepts with their hands, with their feet, and with their mouth, but there are few indeed who truly know the meaning of the service of the heart. Rav Soloveitchik here criticized, obviously, some group of Jews. He embraced them, he respects them, but he also criticized them a bit. Basically, he wants to claim that today we are very much performing the mitzvot. Yes, we keep the mitzvot, we perform them, but we don't feel them. We don't identify them with them. Yes, we keep Shabbat. Yes, we do not do any melacha, any prohibited work that we are not supposed to do. But do you feel Shabbat? Do you feel that this is the holy day that you anticipate for it all other 6 days? Is this the day that when it's come to an end, you are sorry, or you are very happy that Shabbat is over? Those are difficult questions. Rav Soloveitchik says you can know and you can keep all the mitzvot of Shabbat, and to shy away from any prohibited work, but and you perform the mitzvah of Shabbat, but you didn't experience it. He says, I was raised in Chabad town. The population of that town consists almost exclusively of poor people, workers, tradesmen, particularly peddlers, who used to travel to visit the villages within a 15-mile radius of the town. You cannot imagine the primitive conditions in which the Russian peasants lived. The people used to come home every Friday afternoon after spending the week in those primitive villages. I watched them coming into the shul one by one, water glistening from their payas, from the peot and beards, because they had immersed in the mikveh. I still remember the tune with which they started to recite immediately upon entering the shul. The 107th Psalm, God, give thanks to the Lord because He is good. Those redeemed by the Lord shall say it. They sang a hymn of gratitude to God. For what? For delivery from captivity, from freeing them from prison. They would cling to God coming home for Shabbat, though they knew very well that the next day after nightfall, they would return to their primitive villages surrounding the town. Which means he basically gives an interesting memory from his childhood. Just imagine it. Like any other village in Europe, you have few families of Jews, or even, let's say, even the third of the village is Jews, but what do they do the rest of the week? They go from one village to another as peddlers and trying to sell things, dealing with the society and dealing with all the primitive things that were in those villages. They come home for Shabbat. They go to the mikveh, they change their clothes, they start clinging to God. Basically thanking Him for taking them out from this world and bring them for Shabbat. A day of spirituality, a day of family, a day of attaching yourself to God. Knowing that Motzei Shabbat they are going to prepare the wagon to go back on Sunday. But on Shabbat, they didn't keep Shabbat only because God said so. They kept Shabbat because it gave them an anchor for their entire week. To truly understand what Shabbat is, it is insufficient to merely know the halachot, the laws of Shabbat. One should experience a Chassidish shtibel for Shalosh Seudot, a Hasidish shtibel for Shalosh Seudot, which means you need to participate in a Seudah Shishit, in the third meal of Shabbat, among Hasidim. By the way, Rav Soloveitchik was definitely not a Hasid, but look at the memories. Not far from where our family lived in Warsaw, there was a Moditzer shtibel, a Hasidish shtibel, where I would occasionally go for Shalosh Seudot. The Hasidim would be singing Bnei Heichala, it's a song. Hashem ro'i lo echsar, another song from Tehillim, and again Bnei Heichala, again Hashem ro'i lo. It occurred to me that they were not singing because they wanted to sing. They were singing because they didn't want to allow Shabbat to leave. I remember an encounter in this shtibel as a small child. One of the men who had been singing most enthusiastically, wearing a kapota consisting of more holes than material, approached me and asked if I recognized him. I told him that I did not, and he introduced himself as Yankel, the porter. Now during the week I knew Yankel, the porter, as someone very ordinary, wearing shabby clothing, walking around with a rope. I could not imagine that individual of such regal bearing could be the same person. Yet on Shabbat he wore kapota and a shtreimel. That is because his soul was not Yankel the porter, but Yankel the prince. Well, after nightfall, I naively asked him, when do we daven Mariv? He replied, do you miss the weekdays so much that you cannot wait to daven Mariv? For us modern people, it's very hard to identify with that. One of the first things we do immediately after Shabbat is to turn on our phones and to check on things and to plan what we're going to do on Motzei Shabbat. And I'm not going to fight it. That's what we do. But you know what? 1 minute. Just 1 minute. Let Shabbat be there for 1 more minute. So don't rush to Shabbat and don't wait for Shabbat to be over. That will give us an experience of Shabbat. This is an educational, philosophical problem that has weighed heavily upon me, says Rav Soloveitchik, who was very open about his feelings about Judaism. He was one of the leaders of modern Orthodoxy in America in the 20th century. To contemporary Orthodox Jews, the Torah is revealed in intellectual categories, in cold thought and logic. However, it has not merited being revealed in a living sensory mode, which caused both trembling and gladdening of the heart. They recognize the Torah as an idea, but they do not encounter it as an unmeditated reality that one can taste, see, and feel. I can explain Yom Kippur to my students. From an intellectual standpoint, there are much I can transmit. What I cannot pass on, that's what Rav Soloveitchik says on himself, are the experiences that I myself underwent on those days. The American Jew has no awareness of the sublime experience of the sanctity of Yom Kippur. I want to describe to them the ta'am, the taste of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that once existed in Europe, and I can't. I would have to bring them to the house where I was raised and show them how Reb Chaim, that's his family, said the vidui, the confession on Yom Kippur, the gasping for breath, and other tefillot, gasping for breath. In the synagogue, the echo of the amen that followed the Shehecheyanu, blessing after Kol Nidrei. I cannot impart this. It has to be lived. Joshua not only received the Torah from Moses, but also how to live Yiddishkeit. His attendant Joshua, the son of Nun, a lad who did not depart from the tent. Joshua never left Moses' side. He saw how Moses davened mincha, how he ate, how he benched, how he accepted Shabbat, how he said vidui on Erev Yom Kippur. Obviously, it's very poetic, but there is a point. He therefore merited both Mesorot, both traditions, the Mesorah of the mind and the Mesorah of the heart. And although Elazar was greater lamdan, was a greater scholar, only Joshua could transmit Torah to the next generation. I think that this Rav Soloveitchik needs to be taught everywhere, especially to us, who are modern people, intellectuals. We look at mitzvot and we understand the details and we learn the details and we are sometimes even obsessed with the details, but sometimes we lose sight of how this mitzvah should shape who we are, our families. We all understand that if you sit around the Shabbat table with your family, and the only thing that you talk about is, you know what, we just had the Seder a few weeks ago. You can sit around the Seder table, the Passover table, and you can be obsessed with what's the measure of the matzah that you ate, and how much wine did you drink, and did you do the leaning correctly or not, and if you ate it in 2 minutes or 4 minutes or 3 minutes, and if you had 4 kazetim or 3 kazetim, all of that is important, but if you lose sight of what it means to you, and to engage the kids, so what did you do? Shabbat is the same thing. So now I know we all live in a modern world and we would like to be connected all the time. And Shabbat itself, it's very hard to be disconnected from the phones, even though some people will tell you that it's really not that hard because it gives us so much time to be with family. But after Shabbat is over, take 1 minute, 1 more minute. If you always, the minute Shabbat is over, turn on your phones, take 30 seconds to enjoy Shabbat. And then try to really make this connection between the mind and the heart, between the tradition of the cognitive abilities and the heart, the attachment, the emotions, the clinging to God. Thank you.